For as long as there have been people with an appetite for power, there have been people taking up arms, be they literal or metaphorical, against the threats that these individuals, cabals, and conspiracies pose to the ones that we love. And whether you choose to frame this in terms of a battle between the forces of good and evil, or in more modern practical terms, is irrelevant. It's a vicious cycle that consumes generations and nations in a miasma of trauma. And even though sociologists and psychologists tracked the issue decades ago, we seem to keep falling for the same old tricks. It almost seems like there is something in our DNA, some glitch in our neural code that attempts to block our effort to get a handle on this issue. But the problem is ingrained into our evolution. While priests, pundits, and politicians wax eloquent lies, and influencers and podcasters lull their audiences into deeper and deeper apathy, the predator lies in wait for the moment to pounce. It's relatively easy to do when your prey is distracted, its attention pulled away by the ominous promise of terrors to come. We seem unable to contemplate or contend with the fact that the threat has been much, much closer to home this entire time, and that it has already made itself comfortable, often wearing the face of someone that we trust and love. But it has. Generations ago. If the work that I have been doing up to now has been a human rights effort in micro, consider the conversation that you are going to hear today a discussion about human rights on a macro scale. Today, we are simultaneously pulling back and zooming in to where it all begins for each of us. In childhood. The organizations that I have spotlighted are important to be aware of, but not simply because of the influence they wield in our world and the harm that they have inflicted upon our people. They are important because within each, the same traumatic blueprint is exhibited. They are not unique, a fact which underscores how much work still needs to be done. I am doing what I can, but without the wisdom and insight from those who have lived through and survived abuse, I am fumbling in the dark without a light. I am indebted to those who have trusted me enough to tell me about their experiences and share their insights, informing my endeavor every step of the way and convicting me in the work that I am doing. That is why I am so pleased to share my conversation with survivor, author, and activist Peter E. Saunders. Raised a devout Catholic, Peter suffered a childhood of oppression and abuse, betrayed by family, priests, and the church that he loved. Unable to find adequate care as an adult, he founded a charity to support those who had been abused in childhood. His efforts garnered him international attention and support. Even the Vatican wanted him for the Papal Child Protection Commission, and for a time, Peter felt that he was a part of something positive and intentional. But although his position and celebrity afforded him the ear of the leader of the biggest organized religion in the world, not everyone appreciated his efforts. Sinister forces within secular and religious sectors have stalked Peter's steps for years, intent on silencing him once and for all. Silence is the predator's most powerful tool, and for a time, it seemed that it had been wielded against Peter successfully. In an effort to have the final word and lay the record straight, Peter wrote a book. And because of that book, I ended up becoming aware of his life and work. And that is where the conversation starts today, but that is not where it ends. My name is Beck Griffin. Welcome to the Deep Dive Project. Welcome, Peter Saunders, to the Deep Dive Project. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
It's great to be here, Rebecca, from quite a sunny London over here in England.
So excited about our conversation today. I think that a lot of people are going to be very interested in hearing the things that you have to say and hearing your perspective. And I think that this conversation could not come at a more timely point in our world history. So for those who are meeting you for the first time, who are not familiar with your advocacy and your work and your life and everything that you are, would you care to introduce yourself just briefly to the Deep Dive Project community?
Sure. I'm very difficult dealing with anything brief because I can talk for Britain. Um, but to sum me up, I would say I am primarily a survivor of childhood abuse. I was brought up in a Roman Catholic family in London. I was abused by a number of people. Um, I then went to and set up an organization for survivors of childhood abuse because there was no such organization in this country. And that was a long journey, and it attracted, and I attracted a lot of attention from the media and from obviously from survivors around the world. One thing you will know, and I discovered is I used to think that I used to think I was the only one that had been abused as a kid. There's something about the isolationism, that you grow up thinking well, you think you did something wrong. You think you carry the shame, you carry the guilt, and sometimes there are adults later on who compound that by blaming you. We call it victim blaming. But in a word, I just didn't realize that there are millions of folk around the world that have suffered childhood abuse of all forms. Sexual abuse tends to capture the media attention, but physical abuse, psychological abuse, or whatever you want, that they're all pretty insidious. They're all nasty, and they all tend to blend into one mess that leaves victim survivors feeling pretty awful. So I'm very happy that I set up an organization which still exists, but some bad things happened to me, and I was kind of closed down, and I think that was because when you put your head above the parapet on certain issues, you invite trouble. I never really appreciated that, Rebecca. People used to say to me with the organization, I did a lot of media. I would talk to the BBC, to independent TV. I did a lot of stuff with your media, with CNN and the Canadian broadcasters and so on. And people used to say to me, Pete, you're doing a great job, but just watch your back. And I used to say, well, why would I watch my back? I'm speaking truth to power. I'm speaking the truth. I'm not speculating about things. I'm simply saying it as it is. And clearly the knives, the daggers were out for me. And I was silenced in a very insidious and unpleasant way. And I lost my job, I lost my career, I lost my living. And it took me quite some time to recover, if you like, from that. And as a result of that, I wrote a book, and it's all in the book for any of your viewers who would like to get hold of it, and you can read the story, which I hope is very readable. I've had a lot of good feedback about the book. It's not a literary masterpiece. You won't need a dictionary by your side when you're reading the book. But I hope people are able to read it. I think it focuses on a very deep social problem, which is the problem of why people hurt children. And I don't have the answers to that, but the book certainly explores a lot of that. You asked for a brief, who am I? Now I've gone on a bit too long.
No, that was wonderful. Your book, The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth, so help me, a spotlight on childhood abuse. And it's the story of your life and the story of your advocacy and the story of what happens when we, as the ordinary citizens of this world, decide to stand up for what is right and push back against what is wrong. And you
Yes.
realize very, very quickly, I know this, you know this, anybody who works in the human rights space knows that there are powerful forces at
Mm,
play, seen
mm,
and unseen, that are interested in keeping this information, this topic, from entering the mainstream society. There's been
yes.
a tremendous push to stigmatize any type of conversation around anything smacking of
Yes.
any type of child abuse or really just human rights violations in general. And I don't have all of the reasons. I don't have it hammered out exactly why that is the case, but I know that it's true. And
Mm,
to
mm,
your credit, in your book, and I just want to read this brief excerpt because I just think it's perfect. You were discussing the fact that you were being sort of shut down with a friend of yours, and you wrote that he was aware of what had happened to me, and his good question was, who was behind your downfall? All
mm.
I could say is that a few unpleasant people obviously were. They wanted me silenced. They succeeded. And
Yeah,
they did succeed for a time. For a
yeah,
time, the only way that you had to get your story out was through your book, which, in my opinion, should be read by anyone who is interested in understanding child abuse and understanding what happens to the people who suffer this sort of trauma as they move through their lives.
yeah.
It's such a powerful story. But for all of their efforts to silence you, you are here today sitting with me and we are having this conversation. And I would love to know from your own perspective and your own thoughts, how does it feel to be stepping back in and speaking on these topics again after being pretty much silent for so many years?
Well, it's taken about 6 years from when I lost my job until I'm here talking to you. And I compare that to the average time at which an abuse survivor discloses the abuse that they suffered in childhood. And there's a number of different uh, opinions on that, but the general consensus is that it's more than 20 years on average from when a child ceases to be abused to when they may, I stress may, disclose that abuse. And that's pretty much a lifetime. So the 6 years has seemed like a long time for me before I've kind of, if you like, trying to come out again, as it were, and speak out. And I'm still quite wary that there will be people out there in this country, not in America, hopefully. I've got a lot of good friends in America, but there will be people here in the UK who will not want me back out, as it were, speaking out because they are the ones who silenced me. And I have a few names of people who I will never mention, but but they are people I know who would not want me to have a voice. And I cast my mind back to Rebecca to the early years of setting the charity up. I would approach sometimes quite senior politicians, members of parliament, your equivalent of Congress members or senators, whatever. And the vast majority were very supportive and said, "Oh, this is good, Pete. This is great. We need to support you. We need to set this. You need to set this organization up." But there were always some who, as soon as I had contact with them, especially if it was a one-to-one in, say, Parliament, as soon as I said what it was I was doing, you could see them physically change and actually back away from you. And all I could ever think was, they're an abuser, or they are a survivor that hasn't dealt with their abuse, or there's something else sinister going on. Because I can't see any reason why somebody would not engage with a person or an organization that was fully committed to supporting and protecting our children, who I would argue are our greatest asset. And, they are the adults of the future. And they have a right, an absolute right, human right, to have a safe passage through childhood. And yet, to this very day, children in this country, certainly, and around the world, still do not enjoy the safety that absolutely should be a given.
The topic of child abuse ties in with just human rights as a whole. We're talking about human rights, and why those rights have not always been automatically extended to children is a mystery to me. This is something that you talked about in your book, the fact that legislation to protect children has been woefully slow in catching up with the modern age and other legislative decisions that our governments have made to protect other groups of people. And we can definitely talk about why that may be. But in your book, you talk about silence. You talk about being silenced. You also talk about silence being a protector of people who commit these atrocities, but also for the victim survivors themselves, because oftentimes it is simply beyond people to be able to grapple with this and then turn that into something that they can put out into the world as meaningful activism. For some people, that is just not something that they can do, and that's okay, because everyone has to work through and heal from the traumas and the things that we go through in this world in our own ways. But
Mm.
from the very beginning, the entire focal point of the Deep Dive Project has been human rights and raising awareness for the really insane conditions that people are still continuing to live in today in Western civilization, even. And
Mm.
I am so happy to have you here with me today because, I can bang on and on and on about these issues, and I have, and I will continue to do so. But at the end of the day, I am nothing more than a concerned member, a very concerned member of the general public, of society, somebody who believes that this information should be kept track of and recorded in some way. But my work will really only be as meaningful and impactful as people like you allow it to be. And so for me, having you here, a victim survivor of all of the stuff that we are talking about, no one can speak to these issues better than you. No one can elucidate how we should perhaps consider working through and resolving these ills that are in our society than you.
Yeah.
And so having you here speaking today is much more powerful than just me being here alone. And so I want to offer you my platform and my few thousand subscribers, few though they may be, they are passionate and they care. And to give you this opportunity to speak to people for the first time in 6 years.
Yeah, I'm deeply, deeply grateful to you for giving me this platform and to speak to your wonderful subscribers. I just want to share something with you and with them. And it was a story I was told some years ago by a police officer who described being called out to a crime scene, a crime scene of the very worst kind. It was a crime scene where a young child had been raped and murdered and left basically in a field. And the police officer, who the I think we call them senior investigating officer, approached the crime scene, which was the body of the naked child. And upon seeing this dreadful, dreadful scene, he was quite overcome, and he removed his overcoat and placed it over the body of this poor, poor child. A policeman wouldn't and shouldn't do that. I mean, I've watched enough CSIs to know that you don't interfere with a crime scene because you contaminate evidence, etc., etc. This is going back some years. But what he did was kind of the way in which society deals with these unimaginable crimes against our most vulnerable citizens. And the way we deal with them is to cover them up, metaphorically, physically, and psychologically. We don't want to we don't want to look into that evil. We're all capable of doing pretty awful things. And I've done some stupid things in my time. I've got drunk and but I never set out, hopefully, to ever hurt somebody. And most of the people watching this, I hope, would be the same. But there are people who, and they're not all psychopaths, some of them are, but they're not all psychopaths, who set out to hurt others. And the most defenseless people in our society are children. So they are an easy target. So I've always remembered that policeman's account of dealing with the distress by covering it up, by not wanting to really see the awfulness of what one human being can do to another, and to a child. And then fast forward some years, I was talking on the BBC it was a live radio program on BBC Radio 4, which is kind of was the main sort of, if you like, highbrow intellectual radio station broadcast by the BBC. And it was a program called The Moral Maze. And it's still going to this day. And it's a weekly program where a panel of invited experts, if you like, are invited to listen to a proposition and then to debate the morality of it. I'm getting to my point in a minute. When they got in touch with me to see if I would take part, the issue that was going to be discussed was, should we legislate to protect our children from being physically assaulted or hit? Some people would just say, oh, smack. And smack kind of sounds quite, tame. And I had a lovely conversation with the producer of the program. And I said, yeah, I think legislating to protect our children from all forms of abuse is long, long overdue. They've done it in other parts of the world. They've done it in Scandinavia decades ago, and the result has been amazing of taking violence out of the way we bring up our children. And one of the reasons I was so passionate about it was I was brought up in a household and went to a school where physical punishment was kind of normal. I was scared of being hurt. I was scared of my dad because if I did something wrong, naughty as a little boy, my dad would hit me. It was always done in a very controlled manner. It wasn't a violent outburst, but it hurt. And I would be caned or I'd be put over his lap and spanked. And one time I do remember him smacking me around the face when I must have done something terribly, terribly wrong, and I can't remember what it was. Um, and what that did to my relationship with my dad was it meant that I was scared of him and I didn't really have a relationship with him other than one of fear. And I think I wrote about this in the book. That relationship only actually improved, or we only had a relationship as he got a lot older. And then when my dad was dying and he was on his deathbed at home, I got very close to him and we talked. And of course, I couldn't tell him what had happened to me. But the thing was, if I hadn't been scared of him, if I'd had a loving relationship like I've got with my kids, I hope, and my grandchildren, where there are no secrets, where if there's something going on, just speak about it. If I'd had that with my dad, I'm 100% sure he would have stopped the abuse when it started as a child because I could have talked to him. But children, if they can't communicate, if they can't talk to the people who are there to protect them, then they stand no chance. And it was when my dad was dying that I kind of promised him that I was going to try and sort stuff out in my life and in my family's life because our family was very dysfunctional, and I would argue what's left of us is still quite dysfunctional in some way, although I count myself very fortunate that I've had years of great therapy. I had years of having great faith, and I've had some wonderful, wonderful people in my adult life that have loved me and cared for me and supported me. Um, but many don't have that. Many fall by the wayside and end up suffer the trauma that they suffered as a child. They never ever, I don't know if the word recover is the right word, but they never kind of deal with it and are able to move on, which we should all be able to. I belong to a political party in this country called the Labour Party. And I sent a message to a member of parliament here recently saying that if our Labour government do not legislate to protect our children from physical assault, I will never vote Labour again. And of course, I haven't had a reply to that because the last Labour government, 14 years ago, didn't legislate to protect our children. And again, it's these powerful forces, and often it's of people of the religious inclination that trot out something to do with, oh, spare the rod and save the child, and all this stuff, all of which is rubbish, none of which is in any sense um, a permission to hit children. And going back to my faith days, which I still cling to in some ways, the words of Jesus was, if you hurt a child, God help you. And I think that is so true. And there were one or two other very choice expressions that Jesus allegedly said about, if you destroy the innocence of a child, better you hadn't been born, better you be cast into the ocean with a millstone round your neck, etc., etc. It was unequivocal that you do not hurt children in any way, shape, or form. And yet, in this country, and I'm certain it's the same in many of the states in your country, it is still legally okay to hit a child.
Yes.
And if we can't legislate to change the culture around that, then how we are ever going to really face the problem of the widespread sexual abuse, psychological abuse of our children, I do not know. Because again, I think I say in the book that we need a culture change. We need, sadly, children can't vote. If they could vote, it might be a different ball game. But children can't vote in this country. It's 18. Um, if they could vote, maybe it would be a different ball game. But I think we've just got so much work to do, and survivors' voices need to be heard. And I was part of, in fact, I initiated a big inquiry in this country into what might be termed institutional abuse, which includes abuse by clergy,
Yeah.
but by other people from organisations, care homes, orphanages, places like that. Um, and there were some recommendations made as a result of that inquiry. None of them have been implemented yet. Again, if our Labour government do not, then they're never going to get my vote again. But I do believe that they will implement some of them. Um, but it needs to go a lot further, because inherently children, certainly in this country and in many other parts of the world, are still not safe.
I think you're picking up on something that is really, really key here, which is that, well, and this probably goes along with people wanting to cover up the problem of child abuse and not have to look at it. But when you say child abuse, people think in extremes. They're thinking a child being bound and gagged and thrown in a
Yes.
closet, or, the most disgusting predatory behavior that you can think of. But in actuality, what really begins to erode the, I would say it erodes the free will of the child, because it reinforces the thought that they are meaningless, that they have no power, that they have no voice, that the feelings that they have and the thoughts that they have are not worth hearing or not worth
Yeah.
expressing.
Yeah.
uh, Discipline, the type of
Hmm.
discipline that we are discussing here, I would even consider certain types of emotional treatment abusive as well. That's
Yes.
where all of this kind of begins. It begins in the home. And even to that point, we know, statistically speaking, children are more likely, and you can speak to this yourself, more likely to be
Mm.
abused by a family member or close relative than they are by some stranger in a white paneled van with puppies and candy.
Indeed, indeed. And that is a myth that persists as well. And it's a myth that is sort of promulgated and put out there that, oh, it is stranger danger. And it most certainly is not. And the statistics borne out by every bit of research that's been done around this is that children, sadly, are more in danger under their own roof than they are anywhere else, and that the perpetrator of abuse is most likely to be somebody very close to that child. And going back to the point about my dad and legislating to protect, one thing my dad was, he was very religious, he was very law abiding. Now, had we had a law that says you do not hit your kids, I know my dad wouldn't have hit us. He would have had to explore positive parenting, better ways of discipline. And discipline is about leadership. Disciples, follow me. It's not about whacking kids and beating them up. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And another kind of thing that comes out a lot when we talk about child abuse in this country, and again, it's predominantly the kind of right-wing think tanks or the right-wing organizations, most of which seem to be of a sort of right-wing inclination, is it's none of your business.
Hmm.
It's none of your business how I bring up my children. If I want to, if I want to discipline them with a thumping, then you can go take a hike. And that is still very much the culture in this country, and um, we have a history of our main politicians, our major politicians. In fact, most of our prime ministers have gone through a school system called the public school system, which is a private school system. It's the opposite of what you understand in America about private schools, public schools, where violence and beatings have been routine. And in fact, other forms of abuse have been quite routine. And if you were to Google some of the best known private schools in this country, and God knows why Britain sends so many of their children, wealthy Britons, send them to boarding school. I do not know. We're such a small country. There's no reason to send our children off to a boarding school. But the wealthy, a lot of the wealthy still do it. And these schools, including the big names like Eton, which is where most of the royal family send their children. Umpteen prime ministers have been through Eton, or the big Catholic schools like Ampleforth College up in Yorkshire. These have all been breeding grounds for abuse, and so uh, we produce men, and it is predominantly men who come out severely damaged, severely damaged. Um, but but they still own the country. They still run the country. And so we're being governed by people who have actually suffered all sorts of abuse themselves. But the old saying, uh, it never did me any harm, Well, that is a load of rubbish. And if you were to ask the partners of many of these men, and as I said, mostly men, are they damaged individuals? I think the honest answer from their partners will be actually they are pretty damaged. And even somebody like Boris Johnson, who I mention in my book, who was the Prime Minister, he absolutely was abused as a child. I've spoken to his sister who told me that. And I won't go into any more detail than that. But, it kind of it gives you an indication of where this behavior comes from and where this kind of stiff upper lip comes from. That, oh well, we put up with it and we're okay. Well, actually, you're probably not okay. And let's think about the future generations. Let's not hark back to, oh, it didn't do me any harm getting raped and caned, every week. And one of my brothers was caned and abused at our school, and ours wasn't a public school; it was just a good Catholic school. But he was beaten all the time, and sexually abused by more than one of the priests at the school. And he grew up into a beautiful man, but he was an alcoholic and went to a very early grave. And it all stemmed back to his childhood and his schooling. And yeah, it's a dreadful, dreadful problem. And I'm so glad we've got to talk about it. Of course, we've got to talk about it, but I'm glad we're addressing it, and you're, giving me this opportunity to vent my spleen, Rebecca.
Of course, of course. There are so many things that you're saying where I, I, I relate to it on a certain level. I'm very fortunate, very blessed that I was never exposed to sexual abuse. But, I think in this country and in your country as well, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, like I said, of what child abuse is. And there is
Yes.
an unwillingness on the part of parents to acknowledge, one, that the things that happened to them as children were disordered and wrong, and that, two, that is not the way to continue going forward. And I think it's hard for people to do that because no one wants to say, my parents abused me. It's a terrible thing
Sure.
to have to say.
Yeah.
But the simple
Yes.
fact of the matter is, I think we need to be honest with ourselves and have a conversation about the kinds of people that we might be today if we had not been hit and beat by our parents as children. And
Indeed.
I didn't even have the presence of mind to ask myself that question until I really started getting into the work that I am doing now, listening to survivors' stories and hearing your perspective and everything, because it's all part and parcel of the same thing. And a
Yeah.
mutual friend of ours and I have talked a lot about trauma and
Mm.
what that does to a person, how it manifests through their life. And I think you hit the nail on the head with people like your Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And then there are people over here in my government who are also examples. We are dealing with people who are deeply, deeply traumatized,
Yeah.
deeply damaged. And we know science, sociology, psychology has demonstrated that while not all people who have been
Mhm.
abused will go on to be abusers themselves, you are a
Sure.
perfect example of that. There
Sure.
is a percentage of people who will take the things that happen to them and go on to enact them on other people. So
Yes.
knowing that, it seems very, very plain and simple to me what the
Mm.
solution is. And yet we struggle to get to that point as a collective society. And to my country's credit, I have my bones to pick with this country's policies and government and politics and everything else. But on a people level, the citizens
Mm.
of this country, I do see change happening, but it's coming from the grassroots up. It's coming from within these homes, individual parents, millennials, and now Gen Zers who are going to be having children. They are choosing intentionally to do something different. But
Yes.
I have to think to myself, we're dealing with a generation of people, maybe not Gen Z so much, but definitely millennials who
Mm.
were very often exposed to dysfunctional parenting techniques. And we can
Mm.
have the presence of mind to say, I don't want to do that way. That is not what I want to do. That is not who I want to be.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the tools and the resources to help people learn
Yeah.
how to do different, how to be better, then nothing is
Yes.
going to change. And I think I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your nonprofit, NAPAC, and why you felt so convicted to get that up and running, because I have a feeling it ties into all of this.
The motivation to set up NAPAC, to set up the charity, the not-for-profit you would call it, was because I couldn't find anywhere to turn to talk to as a traumatized adult. And this was a little bit before the internet, really. So I would go through all the telephone books and look for whatever, and you could find helplines for all sorts of problems. Whether it's your little puppy's gone missing, there's a helpline for that, or protect the hedgehogs, or all and sundry. But there was nothing for an adult like me to be able to contact somebody and talk to somebody who understood. And of course, there's a myriad of so-called child protection organizations in this country. I mean, the biggest one, interestingly, is the NSPCC, which stands for the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And it's what you said, Rebecca. There's this idea that child abuse is a cruelty issue, as in, being held down, tortured, beaten, which does happen to children, but by and large, abuse is done in a far more insidious, almost, I hate to say loving way, but that is often the way abusers work is to get close to a child by inveigling their way into their life and into their mind, and often into the family's life, particularly if it's a member of that family, because they want to abuse and get away with it. And APAC is about giving a voice to survivors. And what I very quickly discovered was that hundreds, in fact, over the years, thousands of people flocked to the charity and flocked to me personally to say thank you for speaking out. And often that was survivors mostly, but also it was often parents of children that had been abused. And again, there was nowhere for them to go. And there's still a void there for parents of abused children to turn to. You know, we've got Alcoholics Anonymous, you've got Addictions and Anonymous, all sorts of things. But, you know, who supports these children? And when I used to help on our helpline, we have a free phone helpline in the UK. I always remember having this conversation with a woman who rang up, and it was free phone, and so that the number would not come up on somebody's bill, which was always important to us, that people could ring kind of very anonymously and not have to. It didn't have to be shared with anyone else in the household. But this woman rang me up, and she was in pieces. She was very distressed because she'd had a conversation with her daughter. The daughter had come home. She was in her early 20s. She'd come home from work and she was very drunk. And the mother started to sort of admonish her, tell her off, you know. And then this young woman started to say why she was drunk and upset. And the reason was that her grandfather had sexually abused her throughout her childhood. Now, this woman, it was her father who had abused her daughter. The woman said, I know she's telling the truth. You know, my daughter would never lie about such a thing. Everybody in our family adored my dad. They always thought he was wonderful and a wonderful granddad. And she said, and you know, when I look back, my daughter wouldn't go to her granddad's funeral when he died, whenever it was, a couple of years earlier. And she said, I always thought it was because she was very upset that she was losing her granddad, but it wasn't. It was that she just could not go to the funeral because she was glad he was gone. And this poor woman was just in pieces because she loved her dad, who was now being identified as the man who abused her daughter. The daughter was deeply traumatized. You know, it's like ripples that go out in families. It isn't just the perpetrator and the victim, if you like. There's multiple layers of others. Now, and I must have talked to this woman for nearly an hour trying to find help for her, and in the end, she just said, "Look, you've saved my life just listening to me," and that's really that's really all I did. Um, and I said, well, where could you go? What does your life hold for you? Do you go to church? And she said, yeah. She said, but I could never share anything at church because my dad was at church. That is the kind of typical abuse that it is done behind closed doors. It's done in silence. It's done with very, very effective psychological intimidation of the victim such that they cannot speak out about it. And and sometimes there are absolute threats made, and I used to hear from people who said I could never speak out because I was told that if I did, my mother would go to prison, or I would go into a home, or if you tell anybody, daddy will go to prison. What a thing to put into a little child's head. And I don't know if you have that expression in America. We have this rather stupid expression here that goes along the lines of sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, which is total rubbish because I'm 60 something now, I'm old, and I still have the words going through my head that my abusers said to me as a child. That's how traumatizing this dreadful, dreadful thing is. And I'm not going to say the word proud. I'm not sure what proud means, but I was so pleased that I was able to set up NAPAC. And there have been some wonderful people over the last 5 or 6 years have said, Pete, what you did was incredible and it saved lots of lives. And you've but I'm not in that world anymore, and it breaks my heart, which is why I'm so grateful to be having this difficult conversation with you, Rebecca, and thank you.
These
We
conversations are
we need to
so
we need to
important.
talk about it. We need to talk about it.
We have
That's
to. We have
yeah.
to. And I, for my part, um, I am quite angry by I'm furious for the innocent lives that have been hijacked and ruined
Mm,
by abuse of all shades and varieties. And
mm,
that anger is what allows me to continue to speak about these things, bring the headlines and the news and the stories and the survivors to people's attention, because at
mm.
this point in time, I personally no longer care if people find this topic abhorrent, disgusting, don't want to look at it, don't touch it. I don't care. We need to look at it. People have got to look this thing in the eye, be able to
Yeah,
talk about it in public and address it and call a spade a spade. And that ties into the reason why that's so important. It's important so that we can get healing to people. But it's
yeah,
also important because, and you mentioned this in your book, silence aids the people
mm,
who are committing these atrocities. It aids keeping silent about child abuse of any variety perpetrates the misguided belief that child abuse is some extreme form of punishment that you only see in extreme cases,
yes,
or that it only happens with strangers, or that there's nothing that can be done about it. It's just the way things are. All of these things
yes,
are untrue, and the only way that anything is going to change is by forcing people to engage with this topic. And people
yeah.
dig their heels in, they get very upset, especially if they feel like you are attacking by pointing out issues within an institution. You are attacking their institution, be it a political or a religious or a social institution. That's just too damn bad. In my opinion, I hold no quarter for the silence anymore.
I once met with a wonderful young woman who became a volunteer at the charity, who came to see me, and she told me the story of how she had been abused as a child, and she made, I'm going to say the mistake because it was a mistake. She made the mistake of going to see her parish priest to talk to him about what was happening to her. And the response was, I can remember her words, was the priest said to her, I won't say her name, but the priest said to her, when they came for Jesus, he said nothing. When they whipped and scourged Jesus, he said nothing. When they nailed him to the cross, they said nothing. And you, young woman, must say nothing. Now, this was a Catholic priest telling a child who was being abused that she had to keep quiet. And that is what we're up against, I'm afraid. We're up against individuals like that, and they're in every institution, whether it be political, religious, whatever. They're everywhere. And you're absolutely 100% right. We have to shine a spotlight because the one thing abusers do not want is they don't want a spotlight shone on their disgusting criminal behavior, and they do not want survivors of abuse like myself and many others speaking out because it shines a spotlight on their murky and disgusting behavior. So let's keep it up.
With your advocacy work with NAPAC, your advocacy work with volunteering your time just to listen and speak with victim survivors, trying to connect them with resources, you have also done quite a bit of work attempting to collaborate with the Roman Catholic Church. And unfortunately, this is a fact that is simply unescapable. The Catholic Church has a 2,000-year paper trail of abuse. And this is
Mm,
something that has been substantiated and well documented by the church's own historical documents.
mm,
There was a book that was written that presented a study that looked into all of this. It was Sex, Priests, and Secret Codes by
mm,
Richard Sipe et al. And I know that Mr. Sipe has since passed away, but his
mm,
work is exemplary. And despite the fact that that book was written in the 90s, I read
mm.
it a couple of years ago and it's still quite applicable, which I think goes to show how woefully insufficient the Catholic Church's efforts have been to protect children. And
Mm.
you wrote something in your book, and I want to read this really quick, and then I want to hear your thoughts. You wrote that when you were trying to work with the Catholic Church and trying to be heard, you said that I now know that the Catholic Church is really only interested in protecting itself and minimizing the damage. It doesn't give a fig about the people. And what I appreciate now that I didn't appreciate then was that the real church is actually the people, the ones who are Christ's followers. Do we really need an organized body that takes money from us to follow the teachings of Jesus? If God is all powerful, why is it that every Christian church on the planet appeals for money? How come God is not so good with the finances? And I love that because that is a question that I have asked myself on numerous occasions. Um, but you know intimately what it's like to try to work with the Vatican. I want to hear about your experiences from the beginning all the way to the bitter end, and your thoughts and perspective on the Catholic Church, because whether or not people are going to like the things that you say, I believe
Mm.
that you have the position of authority because you are speaking the truth as someone with firsthand knowledge.
Because there will be watching this who are still probably church-going Catholics, and I can assume and believe totally that they are good people and lead a good and faithful life. And what I would say to them is that, my experience was being raised Catholic, abused by a Catholic priest, and went on to meet the Pope and so on. But it's every religious organization has questions to answer over
Yes.
cover-ups. Absolutely. I remember going to it was called a Male Survivor Conference in New York City some years ago. And one of the breakout groups was for people who had been abused in a clergy setting. So the majority, and it was a male only conference. The majority in the breakout group happened to be Roman Catholic, of which I was one. I call myself a recovering Catholic. But there was also people from the Islamic faith. There was also a couple of people from the Jewish faith, and there were one or two others that I can't remember. And that really opened my eyes that it isn't just the Catholic Church that covers up and protects itself before anything else. And I've never understood that. And you mentioned the paper trail going back a couple of thousand years. And again, you're spot on with that. It reminded me of another very powerful quote from somebody who actually happened to be a Roman Catholic, a guy called Lord Acton, back at the end of the 19th century, who is often quoted as saying, "Power tends to corrupt. All power corrupts absolutely." And what he was referring to actually was papal power.
I
Uh,
didn't know that. That's one of my favorite
oh,
expressions.
yeah, 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 yeah. He was. That was in. It was in a letter he had written to a bishop or a cardinal or something about the abuses of papal authority. Um, and it is a very powerful. And look around today at our politicians and what is going on in the world. But to come back to the church, I mean, like many of your subscribers, I was brought up in what seemed to me to be a loving Catholic community. The church was a good experience going to church. I served mass from a very early age. Um, it was a great place to go when you were a young teenager because all the pretty girls used to go to certain services and you made sure you went to those services. And it's stuff. And and I was I was deeply in love with the church, despite the fact that things were happening to me that one would say, and again, you battle with yourself sometimes over, well, hang on a minute, Father so and so abused me. How come I still used to go to mass? But there was always like a disconnect. And because I always had faith in a God, I always thought that kind of God. I don't know. I always thought there was something wrong with me. I always thought that I deserved what happened to me. I must have brought it on myself because, it wasn't happening to anybody else. I'm certain of that. Of course it was, but I didn't know that. But I stuck with the Catholic Church through thick and thin. I went to do voluntary service in Southern Africa. And I had some amazing experiences there. And I re read a, I wrote about them briefly in the book, where I met some amazing priests who really lived the life of a true Christian, where their life was dedicated to helping people, not asking for their money, but for helping people to get through challenging life. And in that part of the world, life was very challenging, partly because people were absolutely poor, and partly because there was a civil war raging around, that left a lot of bereaved families. Um, then there were priests who I would never want to go near again, and who would give me the creeps. And when I set up NAPAC, I had a and I don't think I put this in the book. I should remember, shouldn't I? But I had a very unfortunate experience not long after my dad died, and I was disclosing the abuse I'd suffered. And I was coming out of mass one day, and one of the nuns was coming out of mass at the same time, a nun that I had known since my childhood. Someone that I used to go to Lourdes with when I was a teenager to take sick people on a pilgrimage to Lourdes. And this nun, who up till that time I had always felt great affection for, she came up to me, and she knew my dad had just died not long before. And she said, are you okay, Peter? And I said, no, actually, sister, I'm not okay. And then she said, tell me, tell me. And we walked from the church back to the convent, which was about a half-mile walk. And I kind of told her everything that had happened to me, at the hands of the family member, the priests, my primary school teacher at the Sacred Heart Primary School. And her response, again, I haven't really seen her since, and she'll be elderly now. Her response was, you haven't been to the police, have you? And then the other response was, you need to pray about forgiveness. And I've had that said to me a number of times over the years. And I remember thinking, yeah, I can understand the concept of forgiveness. I can understand the concept of, you know, when you have hatred for somebody, it's you that suffers, not them. Um, and I was just staggered that her first instinct was to protect the perpetrators and not the victim, which was me. And it reminds me one time of an article that I wrote for a newsletter, for the charity newsletter, about the subject of forgiveness. And it was a good article, probably got it somewhere still. And the article basically said, you cannot impose forgiveness on somebody. You cannot say, you will forgive. Um, Forgiveness can only really come about if there is true repentance on the part of the perpetrator. And believe me, Rebecca, the perpetrators of these crimes will never, ever, A, admit that they've done them, and B, they will never say they're sorry for what they've done. That's the nature of the crime. And so, yeah, I am all for forgiveness if it helps people to move on. And when people say I forgive, that it doesn't mean that they're going to let the person off the hook. The person still
Exactly.
needs to go through the criminal system and be dealt with appropriately. And that's the right word, appropriately. And somebody once reminded me that, well, Jesus on the cross forgave the yeah. And someone else says, yeah, but he didn't spare them the death of hanging on the cross when the two alleged thieves were next to him, and he's, one said, get me down from here, you're God, you can save us. And the other one said, shut up, we deserve it, he didn't, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I get the forgiveness argument, but it's you cannot tell someone else that they've got to forgive. You've got to. What I have always said to people who are in distress and trauma is that there are ways of moving on, and it probably involves something called therapy,
Yeah.
and a lot of love.
Yes. And to the point about the, suffering of Christ being brought up anytime somebody is trying to raise awareness of an atrocity. And, I've run into this with my work researching Opus Dei.
Mm.
I can't even tell you how many former members of this organization I have heard or read saying that when they expressed dissatisfaction with the treatment that they were experiencing, or when they pushed back against the really unhealthy atmosphere that is inculcated inside this organization, they're
Mm.
told to offer it up, because the saints suffered so much and
Yeah,
Jesus suffered
yeah,
so much.
yeah,
And
yeah.
to me, I feel like this is, as someone who was raised Catholic and had a
Mm.
very, very rigorous faith formation, I
Mm.
am baffled by that perspective because that
Yeah,
goes against everything that I was taught. If you
yeah.
are a Christian, you believe that Jesus Christ died for your sins, that he
Mm.
suffered the pain of death so that
Yes.
you would not have to suffer it for eternity. So why
Yeah.
in the world are we continuing to haul ourselves up on this cross with him in
Yes.
to suffer when that price was already paid for us? I do not understand it. Get down off of the wood. We need
Yeah.
the wood to build communities for these people. Like, get
Sure.
down off the cross.
Yeah.
And then also with that, and the sister that you mentioned talking to and sort of pouring your heart out to her, her
Mm.
response is very indicative of the mental conditioning that
Yeah.
people are exposed to and brought up in within religious society. And it's not just the Catholic Church. And I want to be very, very clear on that. While that has been the focal point of my research, that's just because I understand the religion very well. But as you
Yeah.
say, it happens across all religions and all strata of society. No one is exempt. But within religious societies, especially, I think that there is a very specific type of conditioning that happens to
Mm.
where you essentially lose your ability to view the institution that you are now a part of as a threat, because it introduces too many other questions. And to that
Yes.
point, there was something that you wrote in like the first half of your book, and let me see if I can find it really quick because I just think
Mm.
it makes my point. You are quoting Mark Twain, and you said he summed it up perfectly when he said, when even the brightest mind in our world has been trained from childhood in superstition of any kind, it will never be possible for that mind in its maturity to examine sincerely, dispassionately, and consciously any evidence or any circumstance which shall seem to cast a doubt upon the validity of that superstition. Now, I
Yeah.
think that that might be a bit of an extreme statement on Mark Twain's part. I don't believe that just because somebody was brought up in a religion that they can't see the forest for the trees and objectively
Yeah.
engage with these problems. But
Sure.
that does happen to an awful lot of people. And you
Yeah.
see that very quickly whenever you are trying to raise awareness about human rights issues and abuses and that kind of thing. And people
Yeah.
really, really push back against that. You'll hear things like, why are you attacking the Catholic Church? Like, why aren't you talking about all of the good things that the Catholic Church has done? You just
Mm.
have an axe to grind. All of these different, and I'm sure you've heard them all too. Um,
Mm. Mm.
I don't understand why we cannot hold two things to be true at the same time. We can hold that religious communities can be tremendous resources and benefits to people's lives, while
Mm.
also maintaining the perspective and the belief that there are people who will use that religious system to take
Mm.
advantage and prey upon other people. And I
Yeah.
cannot help but feel that that is in some way facilitated by the environment that is inculcated inside certain very strict religious sectors.
Yes.
Catholicism, um, Islam, I've heard of it in Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hindu. I mean, it does happen everywhere, but there's something specific that happens to somebody's brain when you're in this very strict, dogmatic
Yeah,
environment. And I think you ran
yeah.
up against that pretty quickly whenever you started trying to work with the Catholic Church. And I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I did. And I was also very fortunate that I encountered and had dinner on more than one occasion with Dick Sipe before he sadly died a few years ago, and my other good friend Tom Doyle, who was also a Catholic priest and a very outspoken spokesperson, if you like, for victim survivors. And they had seen what was going on, if you like, from the inside of the institution. And it's very, very, I'm not a greatly read person, but what I've read about the way in which, for example, many young men become priests, and it is again predominantly men, although women do abuse as well, and Catholic nuns have a sordid history in this country of abusing children in homes and places. But if you take a child into a and I've got a very good friend of mine who is a Catholic priest. He decided he was going to become a priest and went off to seminary when he was about 14. So before he had a chance to, should we say, have a normal childhood and adolescence and, should we say, a sort of sexual awakening, whatever you want to call it, suddenly he's cast into a situation where he's not allowed to speak when he's eating his meals. He has to wear this. He has to call somebody. He has to call everybody father or brother, and he has to completely suppress all his normal basic human instincts, which if you believe in God, you believe that God created man in that image, and God created us to be sexual beings and to have relationships and to love one another. And many of these clergy are denied that human need. And I think it was Richard Sipe talked about, the Catholic clergy are supposed to be celibate.
You wrote about this
And I think
extensively, yes.
he did. And he researched it and came up with some very interesting figures around the sheer number of priests who cannot be celibate and end up having relationships with adults. And there's nothing wrong. That's absolutely fine in my book, whether it's whoever it is, as long as they're an adult and they're a consenting adult and it's a loving relationship. And interestingly, when I was on the Papal Commission, sitting in a room in the Vatican with a couple of cardinals and some bishops and stuff, there was an acknowledgement that there are many priests around the world who are in relationships with primarily a woman, and there are children running around.
I think
I don't
Richard
think
in
there's
his
anything wrong with that.
I think Richard in his book, he said that it's something like slightly more than half of all Catholic clergy members
Yeah,
are non-celibate. They have partners, they have families, they have a
yeah,
life outside of the church. And in that book that I referenced earlier that he wrote, they lay out the history of the Catholic Church's stance on celibacy and all of the different times throughout all of the different councils over literally 2,000 years. They have
yeah,
continued to double down. No, you've got to be celibate. You have to be
yes,
celibate. In order to be a
yes.
Catholic clergy member, you cannot have a family. You cannot, poverty, chastity, and obedience are the standards by which you live. And
Mm,
in my opinion, the refusal to acknowledge that as disordered in any way has contributed to this problem.
yes. And the other thing that struck me was that one of the many ways that the Vatican tried to hit back or push back on the reality of all this was that they then turned to blaming uh, homosexuals. It suddenly became a homosexual problem.
Yes.
And again, it's a very clever diversion
Yes.
because, I have relatives who are gay and they're the most beautiful people in the world who would never harm a soul. And within my family. And the idea that these people, these senior clerics said, "Oh, it's a homosexual problem," it's utter rubbish. It's about traumatized people who end up in organizations that give them an immense amount of power. And there are few people in communities more powerful than the clergyman, the priest, the parish priest, whatever. It's when a priest came to our house, it was like a visit from God. You know,
Yes.
out came the best glasses, and would you bless? Can we say the Rosary, Father? Will you bless our food? And it was, that they are revered people, but they're just people.
Yeah.
And that's what I also discovered when I met the Pope, to come back to that, was I actually got on with Francis when I met him. And this was in the very early days of his papacy, at which point I genuinely believed that there was going to be change. I thought that this is the man who's going to do things, because I'm there sitting with him, chatting with him, and having little jokes with him, and discovering that he's actually quite a normal person. But then it's like the shutters come down. It's the shutters come down, and the all the yes, I'm going to do something. Yes, we can work together and do this. Suddenly, I was shut out of the Vatican because I was getting too much of a voice. I was being given too much airtime. The Times and the New York Times and CNN wanted to interview me about what was going on. And I was willing to speak to them, and I wasn't supposed to speak to them. I was supposed to keep quiet. And again, that's the way these religious organizations work. So there was a tinge of feeling sorry for Francis, because I realized that he's surrounded by vipers.
Yeah.
But as Richard Sipe would have said, and Tom Doyle says regularly, the Pope is an absolute monarch, and there are things that he could do that he has refused to do. And I know that there's been some real advances in some parts of the world with the church, principally, I suspect, in America, because there's been powerful voices in your part of the world. But you look to other parts of the world, and the church is still dominant and is still infested with people who are abusing children and vulnerable people. So sad to say, I don't believe that the institutional church is capable of change. And when Francis dies, God knows who's going to come next as the next pope. But it's 2,000 years and counting, and I don't see any prospect for change, which breaks my heart, because, as I said, I used to be such a what you'd call devout Catholic, and now I'm kind of the opposite.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but it ties into what you're talking about just with the Catholic Church's general unwillingness to really meaningfully contend with these issues. But back when I first began to what we call deconstruct my religion, my religious perspective, I was really working through what I believed, why I believed it, where those beliefs had come from, the whole
Mm,
kit and caboodle. I stumbled upon quite a bit of information about the Catholic Church that I had never been told.
mm,
And I, significant historic events that I
mm,
was never told about, like the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, for
mm.
example, or the reform schools in Canada and the United States, or,
Yeah,
there are some things that have happened in the Philippines.
yes,
Um,
yes,
and what I picked up on very, very quickly is that if you go and you read media from Catholic apologists, and I'll just call them, regardless of whether or not they're posturing as journalists, talk show hosts, whatever, they are apologists for
yeah,
the Catholic Church. You
yeah,
do not have to read very far before you find like scapegoat red herring type statements being made, like, well, we live in such a fallen world, and it's just everyone's so sexually depraved, and it's the homosexuals. I've heard that.
mm,
I've heard that my entire life, that the whole reason why
yeah,
the Catholic Church has gone down the drain is because of the homosexuals. When in
mm,
reality,
mhm,
this has been a very long standing problem. It's not new and it's not recent. And that's another thing, too. There are theories bandied about within the Catholic community of these, like, sinister movements by like individuals representing the Freemasons, for example, well, they've infiltrated the Catholic Church. And so that's why the Catholic Church is the way that it is today. And you and I know that that's horseshit.
Mm.
But people believe
Mm.
that and they buy into it hook, line, and sinker. And I think it's because, and I've talked about this a lot, there is an element of fear at play. I mean, there
Yeah.
fear is a through line throughout this entire conversation, but especially because you're talking about people's discomfort around the concept of death, what happens after we die, the entire inevitability of it all. People want assurances and they want comfort and they want somebody to pat them on the head and tell them that everything is going to be okay. And for
Yeah.
2,000 years, the Catholic Church has been more than happy to lay out a very dogmatic, very, you know, straight and narrow path for how to achieve their version of nirvana. Um,
Yeah.
it's really really interesting when you start digging into that
Mm.
stuff, and it becomes pretty clear that a lot of the accusations being made against these supposed, hostile forces, it's coming from within the organization, and it's coming because there is that unwillingness to admit that there's any type,
Mm.
because these people have so much power. And if and and
Yeah.
there's more of us than there are of them, and if people realized and woke up to the fact that this is really what this institution is, and all these institutions in our world, how corrupt they
Mm.
truly are. And I think you see
Mm.
people are slowly pulling back from, they're pulling back from involvement in organized religion, they're pulling back from involvement in politics, here in my country specifically. Since the 2024 election, there is a huge segment of society that is politically homeless now, because we do
Yes.
not identify with either political party in this country. So
Yeah.
there are changes coming and happening, but like I said, it has to come from the grassroots, because it's not going to come from the top. And people waiting for someone to come in and save them is going to end in heartbreak for
Yes.
everyone. And
Yeah.
you found that out for yourself. There was an event that transpired that essentially led to your uh, permanent removal from the pontifical commission that you were a part of. And I would love for you to get into that if you are comfortable doing so, because I think that situation and that story, it's recent, and it encapsulates exactly what we're talking about here.
I think very early on, when I joined the Papal Commission, they thought, as in, because I got on, when I arrived in Rome, when I was invited to meet the Pope, I hit it off with him straight away. I had a conversation with him, and it's in the book. And I think I think that the senior clerics thought, we've got a good Catholic boy here, who's going to be good for public relations, to be honest, um, because at that time I was still, you could say I was still not playing the Catholic card, but I still had my faith, and I still, believed in God. I wasn't very impressed with the Catholic Church anymore, but I was willing to give it a chance because it was the church of my upbringing, and my parents were very devoted to the church. Um, and they asked me to attend as one of the principal speakers the first press conference after I was invited to join the Papal Commission, which happened a few months after I met the Pope. And so they had me in front of the world's press, and I had a go at the Pope. He had basically endorsed that it was okay to hit kids, and I said, "This, do you know you can get all this on YouTube? I didn't even know that."
Mm-hmm.
But I said that, he made a grave error of judgment. And, what would he know about bringing up kids? He's a priest, and he's been a priest for 50 years, for God's sake. He doesn't know about children and all that sort of stuff. And I even said, he would have probably made a wonderful grandfather had he gone down a different road, because in his life he'd been in love with a woman, he said, when he was a young person, and could have ended up going down a different route. Of course, in a different world, he could have also been a priest and a wonderful father as well. But that's the thing. So when I criticised Francis publicly, um, it made headlines, and clearly it upset the Vatican, and it upset the PR people at the Vatican, principally their main sort of PR guru, who was subsequently replaced by someone from Opus Dei, funnily enough, which you probably know all that. There was some very other weird things that went on in Rome. You know,
Hmm.
we were given talks by people who weren't interested in child protection. They were clearly interested in how to protect the church from bad news. And I was thinking, what is going on here? And I am a bit slow, but I realized then that the whole thing really was just window dressing. It was just a public relations exercise to say that, you know, the church is going to do something about this issue. And there was one cardinal, and I always remember, he's dead now, Cardinal Pell from Australia.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
a guy, a woman I know on the commission, a lovely, lovely woman, who sits in the House of Lords in this country. She met Cardinal Pell when she was over in Rome, as part of a parliamentary delegation, and she actually asked Pell about the issue around abuse, and Pell, who was a cardinal, of course, at the time, said, "Ah, it's all been dealt with. It was, he just basically poo-pooed it and brushed it aside." He also said, and I quoted him again on British television, which didn't go down very well with the Catholic community, was Cardinal Pell said, and you may have heard this or not, but I don't know. He said, "Well, you know, if a truck driver picks up a woman and rapes her, you don't blame the truck company for the actions of that driver." I said, "Hang on a minute." I said, "Yes, you do blame the company because they are ultimately responsible for the actions of their employees.
Yes.
They are, is it vicariously responsible, whatever the word is. But critically, that company would hand over all that information about that driver to the police, whereas the Catholic Church sends their rapists to another parish or to
Hmm.
another diocese
Or to a
or to
cushy
another
retirement home in
country
Florida.
or a cushy retirement home in the sunny south." Exactly. And the more time I spent at the Vatican, the more I realized I was kind of part of something that was really pretty evil, to be honest with you. And looking around at some of the characters that were there, mostly clerics, I have to say, just gave me the creeps. But I had a good relationship with the media. I spoke with a number of other people at the time. Uh, I said that it was time that the Pope came and visited his commission to hear from us. He didn't. And I spoke to the media about that and said that I was appalled that, you know, he would go to other meetings, but he wouldn't come and meet with us. Why? You know, who was stopping him? Was he stopping himself, or was somebody else saying, "Oh, you don't want to go there, Holy Father, you know, it's all being dealt with, because we don't want change." And I said all this to the media. And the next day I'm in Rome. The next day I go into the Vatican, into the meeting, and the commissioner are kind of all sitting around a big table. There's a crucifix up there and there's prayers. And then they started on me. "Why did you speak to the media? You know, you did some interviews with the Times and with this and Washington Post and whatever." And I said, "Yeah, I did." I said, "Because I think it's time that we brought this issue out into the light." And I said, I foolishly said, I also suggested that we should actually perhaps live stream these meetings so that the world can see what we're discussing, those who are interested, because we're talking about the safety of a community of over 1 billion people, which is the Catholic community in the world. Well, in in the commission, it was, "What? No, no, no. Everything has to be everybody has to be done behind closed doors. We have to." And one commission member, who I remember very vividly, a Polish woman, said, "We have to do this in secret." And I said, "Well, look, there you are. There is the problem. If everything is done in secret, that's exactly why abuse persists, exists, and continues because we are not addressing it. We are simply, yeah,
Wasting
yeah,
everyone's
it
time.
frustrates, wasting everyone's time. And I felt so sorry for some of the poor nuns who were there because a couple of the nuns had come up from Africa and they weren't being flown first class like the cardinals and the bishops. They would have been economy class. And I remember one poor nun who was absolutely lovely saying they had to hitch a lift from the airport into the Vatican. Well, there was a limousine turned up when I arrived. So they were even treating their own people, the women, if you've seen Conclave, I don't know if you've seen that film yet, but if
I
you haven't,
haven't, not yet.
I'd urge, I'd urge you to watch it. Um, so they treat their own people appallingly. And at that same meeting, they said, well, we feel that probably you need to step aside, Pete, and maybe we can find another role for you. And so they kind of had a vote, do we vote to give Pete a leave of absence? It was basically saying, are we going to sack Pete or not? And I think there was only about one or two abstentions, but the rest of them voted to get rid of me. And,
And that was that.
it was that was that, and I've had quite a good relationship with Cardinal O'Malley, who was the Archbishop of Boston. Him and I liked him, but like many or most religious, he is sort of totally part of the system, totally part of the system. And my Catholic priest friend who is here, who's a little bit younger than Cardinal O'Malley, but he's still getting on. He never wanted to be a bishop or a cardinal or anything. He always wanted to be a priest for the people. And a bit like those, the priests that I met when I was in Southern Africa, the real priests, the real pastors, people who cared, and it wasn't just about preaching. And I think O'Malley was came across as a very humble, decent man, but there's lots of buts because there was stuff going on under his watch in Boston, and I don't think there's a cardinal or a bishop on this planet that hasn't got blood on their hands, to be quite honest with you, and I think that's really, really sad.
It's incredibly sad. And unfortunately, for my own part, I mean, learning about all of this stuff, reading all of this information for the first time, filling in all of these gaps in the history, you hear it, and it kind of goes back to what Pell had said, about you don't blame a trucking company if a trucker hits somebody, which is bullshit. But also that idea that like there's no institutional problem. It's just a couple of people, few bad apples. But the problem that I have always come back to, and I have yet to get a clear, concise answer from anyone who supports that perspective. The problem
Mm.
for me with that is that at the end of a day, an institution is nothing but the people who are in it. If there are no people in that institution, the institution ceases to exist. And so for me, learning all this information as a Catholic at that time, I was just like, oh my God, if I
Mm.
continue
Mm.
to support this religious institution by virtue
Mm.
of the fact that I am participating in the religious observances, going to these buildings and these facilities, interacting with these people, I am essentially, it feels to me, and I know that not everyone feels that way, and that's perfectly fine, but to me, it felt as if I were complicit in the
Yes.
things that were happening. And I could not be a part of that. And that was ultimately what clinched my decision to leave. And it's heartbreaking because let's presume for a moment, this is up for debate, but let's presume for a moment that every single thing that is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church is true and factual. Let's presume that transubstantiation does actually occur during the Mass, during the celebration. That means that the holiest of holies is being handled
Mm.
by fucking monsters, by
Yes.
monsters.
Yes.
I don't, and for me, I would rather never receive those graces ever again than to
Yep.
receive them at the hands of people like that.
Yes.
And I have to think that Jesus Christ must be horrified to see
Yes.
what has become of his church on earth.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
for me, there's no excuse. There's no way to reason my way out of it. And unfortunately, as you learned yourself over and over again, you want to place faith in these leaders, be they civil, political, or religious leaders. You want to believe they have the best interests of their people at heart and that they are there for the right reasons.
Mm.
Perhaps some are, but you can't know that. There is no way to know. And even it was personally for me disappointing to read about the late Basil Hume and
Mm.
his entire approach to the entire issue, which was pretty lackluster. I mean, you went and you had a conversation with him. You felt like you were heard and he understood the issues that you were raising and that he cared. But
Mm.
ultimately, nothing really changed. And that was really, really hard for me to read because Basil Hume also had released some written statements basically telling Opus Dei to step off and to stop sort of infiltrating these religious communities to recruit people. And he was very, very polite in the way that he did it, very politically correct and everything. He was like all about, cultural differences and, things that are acceptable here aren't acceptable over there and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, that was the message that he was trying to send. But again,
Yeah.
unfortunately, not much has changed because pretty shortly after he released that statement, he passed away. And
We did.
after he passed away, Opus Dei was gifted a church somewhere in the UK, a church community. And I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but you might know yourself. Um,
There's a number of them around
oh,
the
I'm sure
UK
there's
now.
there's more. There are more that have been added
Yeah.
over the time, but that's a perfect example of, we're on our own. We're on our own, and expecting any of these institutions to do anything about them is a waste of effort in my time, in my opinion. And I think you learned that for yourself as well. But you talk about in your book the positive experiences that you had working with media and interacting with members of the law enforcement community and everything. And I think that
Mm.
um, grassroots journalism is still a very powerful tool. And also, even though there are so many problems with the justice system in my country, and I'm sure it's very similar in yours, there are people who are trying to do the right thing. I would love
Mm.
to hear some of your experiences interacting with media and then also with law enforcement and just your perspective on these sort of two different communities and how they view this issue and whether or not you think that they are being proactive enough.
Mm. Well, to take the media first, during my 20 years of setting up and running the charity, I had an incredibly positive relationship with virtually all the media that I came into contact with. And um, I can remember doing so many interviews where at the end of the interview, whether it was radio or TV, I'd come off air and either the presenter would say, "Thanks, Pete, that was amazing. It happened to me as well."
Mm.
Or I'd get out of the room and be going down the corridor at the BBC, and someone would pop out who had heard or listened and said, "Can I have a word for a minute?" And I'd say, "Yeah, yeah." And "Oh, I just saw you talking on the TV, and, da, 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 da. And it happened to me as well, or it happened to my relative." And the media were brilliant. 99.9% of the media were brilliant. But in the last 20 years, I'm afraid that the media in this country, as well as probably over in your part of the world, has become far more politicized and politicized for all the wrong reasons, i.e., more of the sort of right-wing conservative, uh, repressive, oppressive nature of those kind of thought patterns, which I can't get my head around. I mean, I can't get my head around how uh, America, this country, how we are cutting our aid budgets and things like that. To me, that is the work of the devil, that we're not doing stuff like that anymore. and the media have become more and more silent on issues that they should be shouting about because of the influence and the control of these, well, let's call them the billionaires and the oligarchs who seem to control everything now, whether it's your Musks over there or your Rupert Murdochs and these characters who wield such absolute power that we mentioned earlier. Um, and the media can be such a force for good. It's such a way to reach out. And thank goodness that we have people like yourself and many other good people like you who are doing the work you're doing, because we have to have these conversations. We have to mobilize. We cannot let the oligarchs and the neo-Nazis, and some of them are not even neo, some of them are just Nazis, taking over the world. And that is the path we're on. In terms of the criminal justice system, law and order, again, we have a woeful history in this country of too many cases of abuse being uh, closed down for
Yeah.
all sorts of reasons. And it's always something that comes from above. And again, it's one of those sort of I was at a meeting at the House of Lords in Parliament a few years ago, and there was a one of the women, a lady, a baroness, was saying, well, of course, we all know that children lie about these matters. And sitting next to her was a psychotherapist of sort of 40 years standing. It was a German woman. She was amazing. She turned to this baroness and she said, Baroness, I have worked with children for 40 years. I have never once heard them lie about these issues. And it just shut this woman up completely. But that is the woman whose husband controls the BBC, or that is what we're up against. Um, I've met many policemen over the years, and they've all been committed, decent people. And I've been and spoken at police conferences. I've been down to police authorities to talk to their child protection teams. And I've always had nothing but admiration for 99 out of 100 of them. In terms of priorities of crime, sadly, child protection, crimes against children are still way down there. I don't understand that. They should be at the top, but they're not a priority. Some police forces now will say yes, they are, but in terms of resources, the resources put into child protection has always been minimal. And there were some very prominent politicians in this country. One in particular who I never met him, but I used to watch him on TV, and I always thought he was okay as a politician because he used to speak his mind, and he was from up north, as in the north of England, and very down to earth. Now, it turned out he was a prolific abuser of boys. The police officers who were involved in investigating this man when he was alive had got enough witnesses, victims, to speak out that they were going to go and arrest him. Now, this man was a member of parliament. Before he was arrested, these police officers up in Yorkshire or Lancashire, anyway, up the north of the country, they got a visit from the British Secret Service,
Mm.
who demanded that the police hand over all the documents about this offender to them, and that's the end of it. No further action. NFA, it's called. No further action. So that man was able to carry on abusing until he died, which thankfully he did not all that long afterwards. But how many lives had he ruined? And because he was a local MP, he was going into boys' homes where he was beating boys and raping boys, and he got away with murder. And the police were powerless to do anything because somebody at the top of the political tree deemed it was not going to happen.
Your book was very eye-opening for me because I learned about some of the things that have happened in your region of the world that I didn't know about. And that's part of what has made my work so interesting is that I am gaining a much broader perspective of the world because I keep an eye on news headlines from different countries all around the world. I don't just pay attention to North American legacy media.
Sure.
And so through your book, I learned about people like Jimmy Savile, for
Yeah.
example, which
Yeah.
I am shocked that I had never heard his name before. But given what I read in your book, I suppose I shouldn't really be that surprised.
Sure.
He was essentially the Jeffrey Epstein of
Yeah.
your country, and
Yes.
he was protected all up and down the chain by all sorts of kinds of people who would have stood to lose too much or would have been
Yes.
exposed themselves had they done the correct thing and brought him to justice the first time.
Yes. Yes. And he was a man who whose offending first came to light, would you believe this, back in the 1950s. So he was abusing young girls in the 1950s. He was, I believe, arrested. He then intimidated the victims, maybe paid some money. And from that time until his death, 50 years odd later, the number of victims were countless. And you are right, he was protected by political forces. He had the local police force under his thumb. And he was a most intimidating character. I actually physically came into contact with him once, and this was interesting. And this was quite a few years ago. It would have been about 35 years ago. I was living up in the north of England, and I'm a cyclist, and I was out on my bike with a couple of my training pals. And as we were cycling over the Dales, the Derbyshire Dales, we noticed ahead there was like a little convoy, and there was a chap who was doing a sponsored walk, and he was walking from John O'Groats to Land's End, which is the extremes of the UK. And it was this guy called Jimmy Savile, and Jimmy Savile was a household name, and he was a very popular character, certainly with a lot of young people, because he had a weekly pop radio show on the radio. He used to do something called Top of the Pops, which used to be on British television every week. And he was this flamboyant, eccentric, idiotic kind of guy. When we got alongside him on our bicycles, we expected him to be the nice guy that we saw on the TV or heard on the radio. And we rode up alongside him and we said, "Hi, Jimmy," not knowing anything about his history then, of course. And he just said, "All right, lads, on your way, on your way." He was quite unpleasant. If we'd been three young girls on bicycles, I'm pretty damn sure he would have said, "Right, I'll meet you in my caravan down at the end of the road and we'll have a drink together," or something like that. He was a prolific abuser, and he got away with murder over decade after decade. And yeah, what more can you say? And of course, he had a wonderful Catholic send off from the cathedral up in Leeds when he died.
Your book, I will be leaving a link to purchase it online for anyone who has not read your book yet. It is a must read for anyone who would like to have a more holistic appreciation of this issue. And in fact, I'll link some other titles down below as well that I think are just important reading for people who are ready to actually contend with this issue. We have been talking for quite some time, and I could continue to talk to you until the sun sets, but I don't want to take up all of your time. You've been so incredibly gracious. So, is there anything else that you feel you must say to me or to my audience here today that you haven't yet?
I would say, first and foremost, thank you to you.
You're welcome.
The amazing work that you do and the amazing person you are. And thank you to those people who have managed to stick with this conversation, because I know I do go off at a tangent from time to time, and I do talk too much. But I think the way that we tackle these problems, and there's no bigger problem than the protection of our children. Just keep doing what you're doing, and to everybody out there, yeah, please buy my book. That would be very helpful to me. I didn't write it thinking it would ever make. But somebody told me you'll never make money from writing a book, and I think that unless you're Jeffrey Archer or J.K. Rowling or something, you never make money from books. But I wrote the book as a statement of truth, and that's why I couldn't think of a better title than the truth. Maybe it's a naff title, but
No, it's
but
perfect.
I would implore people to read it and to feed back to me and to be in touch. And if anyone's over in the UK, I'd always be delighted to meet up and discuss this with anybody anytime because I'm retired. I'm very fortunate. I've got a wonderful wife. All of our kids are grown up. We've got loads of grandchildren and stuff. But th this is the passion of my life is to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. And mercifully, our children and our grandchildren are growing up in a loving, violent, free society, well, house.
Yes.
And that's really, if the world is just, we have so many problems and so many fears and anxieties. And to finish off with, for our people of faith, the expression that Jesus used more than any other reading the Bible were three words, was do not fear. And apparently in the Bible, he said those words on 365 occasions, which just happens to be the number of days in the year. I don't know if that's coincidence or whoever wrote the Bible, whoever it was, probably lots of different people. I think that's quite a powerful message because J Jesus, for me, is about love, not about putting the fear of God into anybody. And if you do believe, then you have my deepest respect as well.
I am so incredibly grateful to you for your unwavering dedication to this cause and to raising awareness and to, if nothing else, creating a safe environment for your own family and for the children that you have had. That that is so incredibly powerful. Ending those generational scourges is
Yeah.
so challenging, and it's powerful. I've watched my own parents do that, and it's powerful and it's liberating, and it sends ripple effects out through society beyond just your own immediate family into the people that your family members interact with and who they will interact with. It's everything. And for my part, I have loved the opportunity that I've been given to speak to people like you, people like Gareth Gore, numerous other just incredible activists, writers, journalists, people who are genuinely trying to do the right thing. And for you, you have so much wisdom and perspective because you've been alive so much longer than I have. And I had somebody comment on a recent episode of mine. They were like, this is all old information. You kids, I knew this back in the day, whatever, whatever. And I was like, yeah, but you got to refresh the information every couple of generations. You got to keep it current and you got to keep bringing it up. And that's why I'm so appreciative of you sitting down with me here today, because you have lived through all of this, all of the decades and decades and decades, different political leaders, different church leaders. You've met so many figures. You understand this issue in a depth and a level that somebody my age probably wouldn't, just because you've lived it and you've lived those years. We'll get there ourselves eventually in time, but we need the guidance of people like you and people like your wife and organizations, charities like NAPAC and SNAP and all the rest. Even though they have their own challenges too. Nothing is perfect, but it's also important. So with that being said, where can people find you if they are interested in reaching out to you?
If they read the book, there are social media contacts in the book. I am contactable, and of course, the book is written by Peter E. for Edward Saunders because there's lots of Peter Saunderses around. So I thought to differentiate myself, I better use my full name. I'm just Pete to my friends and to most of my family. But yeah, always delighted to hear from anybody, and I would always respond.
Awesome. I will include all of those details, links to your social media and everything down below so that people can reach out to you if they so choose. I have a feeling that this is not going to be the last conversation that you and I have.
I
Um,
hope so.
so I am looking forward to the future because I do believe that we have the power to change the course and the trajectory of our society. That's a
Mm,
conviction that I hold dearly, and I know that you hold it as well. And it's been incredibly galvanizing for me to be able to speak with you, because this can be very, very isolating work, and it can often feel like you are either shouting alternately at a brick wall and or into a void. And so when these bright little spots of humanity come in and touch your soul,
mm,
that is, it's powerful. So
yeah,
thank you
sure.
for being with me here today.
I look forward to talking to you again, Rebecca.
Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this episode. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and sharing this interview with someone that you know. If you want to reach out, Pete's contact information, a link to purchase his book, and where to find him on social media have been left in the description below. If you would like to connect with me, you can also find my social media and email in the description of this episode, along with a link where you can virtually buy me a cup of coffee for $5. The Deep Dive Project is a fully independent venture, and due to the nature of the information that I am sharing, episodes are often not eligible for monetization or are throttled by YouTube's algorithm. So I am deeply appreciative of everyone who has supported my caffeine-fueled endeavor up to now. My recent supporters are listed here on screen, and I am forever grateful for their support and generosity. Lastly, if you or someone that you know is in need of mental health support, I have linked a variety of global mental health resources down below. Life is hard, but we do not have to go at it totally unequipped or unassisted. If you need help, please reach out. Thank you so much for being here, and remember, no lite te bastardes carborundorum. Don't let the bastards drag you down.